Get him out of my hotel before he embarrasses the rest of our guests. The words slammed across the marble lobby with such certainty that conversation stopped in mid-sentence, the soft piano music suddenly feeling too small for the silence that followed. Every pair of eyes turned toward the man standing alone beside the revolving glass doors. Ethan Brooks didn't react. At 42 years old, dressed in a charcoal hoodie, faded blue jeans and well-worn sneakers, he looked nothing like the image most people expected when they imagined someone checking into one of Manhattan's most exclusive luxury hotels. He carried a single black duffel bag over one shoulder, a small leather backpack in one hand, and the calm expression of someone who had long ago learned that first impressions often revealed far more about the observer than the person being judged. Behind the polished reception desk stood Greg Sullivan, the hotel's front office manager, straightening his navy suit jacket as though his authority needed no introduction. His sharp smile never reached his eyes. "Sir," he said loudly enough for nearby guests to hear, "this property is reserved for paying guests. I'm going to ask you to leave before security escorts you outside." A few travelers exchanged uncomfortable glances while others quietly looked away, pretending to scroll through their phones. Across the lobby, a middle-aged couple paused beside an arrangement of fresh white orchids, whispering to each other as they watched the scene unfold. Ethan slowly lifted his eyes toward Greg, his expression composed, almost thoughtful, as if he were studying a familiar pattern rather than experiencing an unexpected insult. "I have a reservation," he replied in an even voice. There was no anger, no frustration, only quiet confidence. Greg gave a short laugh. "I'm sure you believe that." His words floated through the lobby like polished glass, cold and carefully aimed. "But this isn't the kind of place where people just walk in and claim a suite." Ethan reached into his backpack and removed a simple leather wallet. Before he could present his identification, Greg casually lifted one hand. "Don't bother. I've been doing this long enough to recognize when something doesn't add up." The statement settled heavily over the room. A young bell attendant standing near the elevator shifted uneasily but remained silent. At the concierge desk, Emily Carter looked up from her computer, her fingers freezing above the keyboard as she caught Ethan's name on the reservation dashboard for only a brief second before another notification covered the screen. She blinked, certain she had read it correctly, yet Greg's unwavering confidence made her question what she had seen. Ethan slipped the wallet back into his pocket without protest. He neither defended himself nor demanded respect. Instead, he glanced around the grand lobby, taking in the crystal chandeliers, the polished limestone columns, the smiling promotional photographs celebrating world-class hospitality, and the guests now watching from expensive leather chairs with quiet curiosity. Everything about the room promised welcome. Everything happening inside it delivered the opposite. Greg folded his arms. "Last chance, sir. Walk out with your dignity while you still can." Ethan looked directly at him, offering nothing more than a faint, unreadable smile, the kind that suggested he had already seen how this story would end long before anyone else in the lobby realized they had become part of it. Ethan Brooks remained exactly where he was, neither stepping forward nor backing away, as though the polished marble beneath his feet belonged to patience rather than urgency. His breathing stayed slow and measured while the whispers around the lobby grew louder. Some guests assumed he was embarrassed. Others believed he was deciding whether to leave before security arrived. None of them imagined that silence could be a decision instead of surrender. Greg Sullivan interpreted the quiet as hesitation and allowed himself another confident smile. "You are making this much harder than it needs to be," he said. "There are plenty of hotels a few blocks away." Ethan simply nodded once, as if acknowledging the suggestion without accepting it. He slowly reached into the side pocket of his backpack and removed a folded reservation confirmation, still perfectly crisp despite having traveled across the country. Before he could unfold it, Greg shook his head dismissively. "Printed papers do not prove anything anymore." Ethan carefully returned the document to his bag without argument. His calm puzzled several people watching nearby. Most guests who found themselves falsely accused would have demanded a supervisor, raised their voices, or insisted on proving they were right. Ethan did none of those things. He quietly observed every detail instead. He noticed the concierge greeting wealthy travelers with effortless warmth. He noticed the doorman rushing to open doors for guests wearing expensive watches. He noticed how quickly smiles disappeared whenever someone believed a person did not belong. Every expression became another piece of information. Across the lobby, Emily Carter could not ignore the uneasiness growing in her chest. She discreetly reopened the reservation system, while pretending to organize afternoon arrivals. The name appeared again for only a second before another employee update flashed across the screen. Ethan Brooks. Presidential Suite. Executive arrival. The record vanished almost immediately beneath several new notifications, but she knew she had not imagined it. She glanced toward Greg, wondering whether he had somehow missed it or simply refused to look. Ethan rested his duffel bag beside a leather chair without sitting down. He looked completely at ease, almost as though time itself worked for him instead of against him. The grandfather clock near the elevators ticked steadily through the silence. Every passing second seemed to increase Greg's confidence, while strengthening Ethan's composure. A businessman waiting for transportation quietly leaned toward another guest and whispered, "He should probably just leave." The woman beside him answered softly, "Maybe. But he does not seem lost." Those few words lingered in the air longer than anyone expected. Ethan's eyes briefly settled on an oil painting hanging above the fireplace, a portrait of the hotel's founder extending a hand to arriving visitors beneath the words, "Hospitality begins with respect." The irony was impossible to ignore. Years earlier, when Ethan had been 24 and building his first technology company from a rented apartment in Detroit, he had walked into another luxury hotel wearing clothes almost identical to the ones he wore today. The receptionist had assumed he was delivering food instead of attending an investment meeting. He remembered leaving without anger, promising himself that success would never change the way he treated strangers. That promise had followed him through every boardroom, every acquisition, and every billion-dollar negotiation. Now standing once again inside another elegant lobby filled with polished smiles and quiet assumptions, Ethan realized some tests never truly ended. They simply changed locations while asking the same question: who decides whether someone belongs before learning who they really are? Greg Sullivan glanced toward the security desk and gave a subtle nod that required no explanation. Within seconds, 2 uniformed security associates began walking across the lobby with calm, deliberate steps, careful not to alarm the surrounding guests, while making it obvious who their attention was focused on. The conversations around the fireplace faded into uneasy silence, as people instinctively watched what would happen next. Ethan Brooks remained exactly where he was, one hand resting lightly on the handle of his duffel bag, his expression as steady as it had been since he first entered the hotel. One of the security associates stopped several feet away and spoke politely. "Sir, our manager has asked that you leave the property." Ethan met his eyes with quiet respect. "Has anyone verified my reservation?" The question was simple, direct, and impossible to misunderstand. Before either security associate could answer, Greg stepped forward again. "There is nothing to verify. We have already determined you are not a registered guest." His voice carried across the lobby, inviting everyone nearby to hear his conclusion as though repeating it would make it true. Ethan did not respond immediately. Instead, he looked toward the reception desk where Emily Carter was standing unusually still. She could feel her heartbeat quicken as she reopened the reservation dashboard for the 3rd time. The same name appeared once more. Ethan Brooks. Presidential Suite. Executive arrival. A special notation sat beneath the reservation, partially hidden behind another system alert. Before she could read the remainder, Greg's voice interrupted her concentration. "Emily," he called sharply, "close that screen and prepare the next guest." She hesitated for only a moment before minimizing the reservation window, but uncertainty had already settled in her mind. Something about this situation no longer made sense. Nearby, a well-dressed guest wearing an expensive tailored suit smiled with quiet amusement and whispered to his companion, "Some people really think confidence can replace money." His companion chuckled softly without taking her eyes off Ethan. Another traveler standing near the concierge desk frowned instead. "He has not argued once," she murmured. "Most people causing trouble do not stay that calm." The observation lingered longer than the laughter. Greg folded his arms once again. "Sir, I am asking you one final time. Pick up your bags and leave before we are forced to document this incident." Ethan looked around the lobby as though memorizing every face, every expression, every reaction. The polished stone floors reflected the afternoon sunlight pouring through the enormous glass entrance, while a fountain quietly flowed beside the grand staircase, creating a strange contrast between elegance and discomfort. Hospitality surrounded the room in appearance alone. Then Greg took another step closer and pointed toward Ethan's duffel bag. "If you refuse to leave, we will remove your belongings from the lobby ourselves." The words caused Emily to look up immediately. She finally gathered enough courage to speak. "Mr. Sullivan," she said carefully, "I believe there may actually be a reservation under his name." Greg turned toward her with visible irritation. "You are mistaken." Emily swallowed. "I saw it more than once." Greg answered without lowering his voice. "Then you saw the wrong screen. Do not create confusion where there is none." Emily fell silent, but doubt had already spread beyond her workstation. Several nearby guests exchanged glances, sensing the first crack in Greg's certainty. Ethan noticed it as well, yet he offered no satisfaction, no argument, and no attempt to expose the truth. He simply stood with the same composed posture, allowing every assumption in the room to grow heavier under its own weight while the sound of approaching footsteps echoed faintly from somewhere beyond the hotel's revolving doors. Emily Carter could no longer convince herself that what she had seen was a mistake. While Greg Sullivan turned his attention toward a newly arriving couple in designer coats, she quietly reopened the reservation system once more, careful to shield the monitor from curious eyes. The same record appeared immediately. Ethan Brooks. Presidential suite. Executive arrival. This time she noticed something else beneath the reservation. A discreet internal designation identified the guest as requiring direct executive coordination upon arrival. Before she could read another word, Greg looked back toward the desk. Emily minimized the screen at once, but the truth had already settled in her mind. She stepped away from the computer and walked carefully toward the center of the lobby, her heart beating faster with every step. "Mr. Sullivan," she said, keeping her voice respectful but clear enough for nearby guests to hear, "I believe we should verify his reservation before asking him to leave." Greg slowly turned toward her, disbelief spreading across his face. "Emily, return to your station." She remained where she was. "I have checked the system several times." Greg answered with growing impatience. "Then stop checking. I have already made my decision." The words hung in the air with an uncomfortable finality. Ethan watched the exchange without interrupting. His calm remained unchanged, but his eyes briefly met Emily's, offering the smallest nod of appreciation before returning to the lobby around him. That simple gesture strengthened her resolve more than any speech could have. Near the grand piano, an elderly woman wearing a navy travel suit quietly placed her magazine on the table and stood. She had watched the entire encounter from the moment Ethan entered the hotel. "Young man," she said while looking directly at Greg, "I have been sitting here for nearly 20 minutes. That gentleman has done nothing except answer your questions politely." Several guests turned toward her. She continued, "If this hotel prides itself on hospitality, then perhaps someone should begin practicing it." The silence that followed carried a different weight than before. A businessman waiting for his car lowered his phone. A family checking out paused beside the elevators. Even one of the security associates shifted uncomfortably, glancing between Greg and Ethan as though uncertain which instruction deserved his loyalty. Greg forced a professional smile that looked increasingly strained. "Ma'am, this is an internal matter." The woman answered immediately. "Respect is never an internal matter." A few heads nodded quietly around the lobby. Emily took another careful breath. "If there is even a small chance that his reservation is valid, we owe him the courtesy of confirming it." Greg's composure began to crack. "Enough," he replied sharply. "You are speaking outside your responsibility." Emily lowered her voice but refused to retreat. Treating guests fairly is part of everyone's responsibility. The atmosphere inside the lobby changed almost imperceptibly. The whispers were no longer directed at Ethan. They were directed at Greg. People who had silently accepted his judgment only minutes earlier now questioned it among themselves. Ethan remained exactly where he had been from the beginning, saying nothing, asking for nothing, allowing the room to discover its own conscience. Then, through the towering glass entrance, The quiet rumble of an approaching luxury sedan rolled beneath the sound of the fountain. The doorman instinctively straightened his posture. Valets hurried toward the curb. Several longtime employees exchanged surprised glances, recognizing the vehicle before it had even come to a complete stop. Whatever was about to happen next, it was immediately clear that someone very important had just arrived. The black sedan came to a smooth stop beneath the covered entrance, but before anyone could focus on the arriving passenger, Greg Sullivan made one final decision that would define the rest of his career. Determined to prove he still controlled the situation, he walked directly toward Ethan Brooks and pointed at the duffel bag resting beside the leather chair. "This conversation is over," he declared. "Take your belongings and leave the property immediately." Ethan looked at him with the same composed expression that had never once faded. "Are you certain this is the decision you want to make?" Greg answered without hesitation. "Absolutely." He reached down, lifted the duffel bag by its handle, and carried it several steps toward the revolving doors before placing it neatly beside the entrance. The gesture was not violent, but its meaning was unmistakable. Gasps quietly rippled through the lobby. Emily Carter lowered her eyes in disbelief. The elderly woman who had defended Ethan slowly shook her head. Even one of the security associates appeared uncomfortable, taking half a step backward as though he suddenly wished to be somewhere else. Ethan calmly walked to the entrance, picked up his bag without complaint, and returned to exactly the same spot where he had been standing moments earlier. He set the bag down gently and folded his hands in front of him. "I will wait," he said softly. Greg laughed under his breath. "You are unbelievably stubborn." Ethan offered no reply. His silence was neither surrender nor defiance. It was certainty. As the fountain continued its steady rhythm behind him, an old memory surfaced with remarkable clarity. 20 years earlier, Ethan had stood inside another luxury hotel on the outskirts of Boston, wearing the only suit he could afford after borrowing money for a business conference. The receptionist had looked at him, smiled politely, and asked whether he was delivering packages to one of the meeting rooms. When he explained that he was scheduled to present his startup to a room full of investors, she quietly suggested that he wait outside because the lobby was reserved for registered guests. He remembered standing on the sidewalk that afternoon, watching executives walk through the same doors that had quietly closed behind him. He had promised himself that if success ever found him, he would build companies where dignity was never determined by appearance. That promise had guided every hiring decision, every partnership, and every acquisition throughout the years. Yet standing inside this magnificent hotel, surrounded by polished marble and flawless architecture, he realized that elegant buildings could still shelter outdated assumptions. Emily watched Ethan from across the lobby, and something about his composure unsettled her more than any argument could have. People who had nothing to hide usually fought to prove themselves. Ethan seemed completely unconcerned with proving anything at all. It was almost as if he already knew that the truth required only time. Outside, valets hurried toward the newly arrived sedan with unusual urgency. One employee quickly adjusted his tie. Another opened the rear passenger door with both hands. The atmosphere at the entrance shifted instantly. Staff members who had ignored every arriving vehicle that afternoon suddenly stood perfectly straight. Greg noticed the activity and instinctively smoothed his jacket before turning away from Ethan. Whatever important guest had arrived deserved his full attention. He had no idea that the person stepping out of that elegant black sedan was not about to check into the hotel. He was about to change everything that everyone inside believed they understood about the quiet man still standing patiently in the middle of the lobby. The moment the rear door of the black sedan opened, every employee near the entrance straightened instinctively. Valet stopped moving. The doorman stood perfectly still with both hands clasped in front of him. A distinguished man in his early 60s stepped onto the sidewalk wearing a tailored charcoal overcoat, polished black shoes, and a silver tie that reflected the afternoon sunlight. William Harrison, the founder and owner of Harrison Grand Hotels, rarely appeared at any of his properties without advance notice. His visits were known throughout the company as moments when every detail mattered. Greg Sullivan hurried across the lobby with a polished smile that had been absent only moments earlier. "Mr. Harrison, welcome back," he said confidently. "We were not expecting you this afternoon." William acknowledged him with a brief nod but did not slow his pace. His eyes moved beyond Greg almost immediately, scanning the lobby with quiet precision as though searching for someone specific. The room seemed to hold its breath. Emily Carter noticed something unusual before anyone else did. William was not admiring the flowers, greeting returning guests, or asking about occupancy numbers. His attention remained fixed on the quiet man standing beside the leather chair with a single duffel bag at his feet. Greg continued speaking, unaware that he had already lost William's attention. "We had a small disturbance with an individual claiming to have a reservation," he explained with an uneasy laugh. "Security has everything under control." William finally stopped walking. His expression remained calm, but there was unmistakable disappointment in his eyes. "A disturbance?" he repeated quietly. Greg nodded. "Nothing that should concern you, sir." William looked past him once again. Ethan Brooks had not moved. He simply offered the faintest smile, as though greeting an old friend after a long journey. The two men held each other's gaze for several silent seconds, while the rest of the lobby struggled to understand what they were witnessing. Emily felt her pulse quicken. The elderly woman who had defended Ethan folded her hands together with quiet anticipation. Even the security associates lowered their shoulders, sensing that the atmosphere had shifted in ways they could not yet explain. William resumed walking, but not toward the reception desk. Not toward the elevators. He walked directly across the polished marble floor until only a few feet separated him from Ethan. Greg hesitated before following, suddenly uncertain whether he should interrupt. "Mr. Harrison," he began carefully, "this gentleman has been refusing to leave the property." William raised one hand gently, stopping him without a single harsh word. The gesture alone carried more authority than any raised voice. Greg immediately fell silent. Ethan remained composed, his posture unchanged, his eyes steady. "Good afternoon, William," he said warmly. "I hope the drive from the airport was smooth." Several employees exchanged confused glances. Ethan had spoken as though they had known each other for years. William's face softened into a genuine smile that none of the staff had ever seen directed toward a guest. "It was," he answered. "Although I regret arriving a few minutes later than I intended." The words landed quietly, yet they transformed the room. Greg's confidence began to disappear beneath growing uncertainty. Emily looked from William to Ethan and back again, realizing that every assumption made since Ethan entered the hotel was beginning to unravel. Then William slowly reached inside the pocket of his overcoat, his hand closing around something that immediately drew the attention of every person standing in the silent lobby. William Harrison slowly withdrew an elegant gold master key, attached to a polished black leather fob embossed with the Harrison Grand crest. Every employee in the lobby recognized it instantly. It was not a room key. It was the master key reserved for only one person at each property, a symbol of complete trust and unrestricted access. The room fell so silent that even the gentle sound of the fountain seemed distant. William stepped forward until he stood directly before Ethan Brooks. Without ceremony, without hesitation, and without looking at anyone else, he extended the master key with both hands. "Welcome home, Ethan," he said warmly. "I apologize that I was not here to greet you myself." Ethan accepted the key with a grateful smile and a quiet nod. "You arrived exactly when you needed to." No one spoke. Greg Sullivan stared at the key as though his mind refused to accept what his eyes had already confirmed. Emily Carter covered her mouth in disbelief. The elderly woman smiled softly, almost as if justice had finally decided to enter the room. William turned slowly toward the gathering of employees and guests. His calm voice carried effortlessly across the marble lobby. "Allow me to introduce Mr. Ethan Brooks." He paused just long enough for every eye in the room to settle on Ethan. "He is the founder and chief executive officer of Brooks Global Hospitality. Beginning next quarter, our companies will officially merge under a strategic partnership that we finalized 3 months ago." Several guests exchanged stunned glances. Greg's face lost its color. William continued. "Today was supposed to be Mr. Brooks' first private visit to one of our flagship hotels before the public announcement. He wished to experience our service exactly as any guest would." The meaning of those words spread through the lobby with unmistakable force. Ethan had never announced his title. He had never demanded special treatment. He had simply asked whether anyone would verify his reservation. William looked directly at Greg. Instead, he was questioned, dismissed, and repeatedly told he did not belong. Greg struggled to respond. "Sir, I believed." William gently interrupted him. "You believed appearances were enough to replace professionalism." Ethan finally spoke, his voice as calm as it had been from the moment he entered the hotel. "The problem was never that you did not recognize me." He looked around the room, meeting the eyes of employees and guests alike. "The problem was how quickly you decided that someone who looked like me could not possibly belong in a place like this." No one attempted to argue. Even the guests who had quietly laughed earlier lowered their eyes. Emily felt both relief and sadness at the same time. Relieved that the truth had finally emerged and saddened that it had required such humiliation before anyone was willing to look beyond assumptions. William nodded respectfully toward Ethan. "You once told me that the true measure of a luxury hotel is not the marble in its lobby or the thread count of its sheets." Ethan smiled faintly. "It is how the first stranger through the door is treated before anyone knows their name." The sentence settled over the room with extraordinary weight. In that single moment, the expensive furniture, sparkling chandeliers, and flawless architecture seemed insignificant beside the simple truth that had just been spoken. The greatest display of authority that afternoon had not been wealth, ownership, or status. It had been patience. And everyone standing in that silent lobby finally understood which person had possessed it from the very beginning. Greg Sullivan opened his mouth several times before any words came out. Every explanation that had sounded convincing only moments earlier now seemed painfully small against the truth standing in front of him. "Mr. Harrison, Mr. Brooks, I sincerely apologize," he said, his voice noticeably quieter than before. "I made a mistake." Ethan looked at him calmly. "You made several decisions, Greg. Calling them a mistake does not change how they affected people." William Harrison turned toward the reception desk and spoke with the same measured tone that had never once risen above conversation. "Please contact Corporate Human Resources immediately. I would like today's incident formally documented, including every statement made before my arrival." Emily Carter quietly reached for the phone without hesitation. Greg instinctively took a step forward. "Sir, perhaps we can discuss this privately." William shook his head. "Everything that happened took place publicly. Accountability should be no different." The words settled across the lobby with unmistakable clarity. Within moments, the front desk computer chimed softly as a secure corporate video conference connected. A regional operations director appeared on the screen, greeting William before listening carefully as he summarized the events in only a few precise sentences. There was no exaggeration, no anger, only facts. After reviewing the preliminary notes and hearing confirmations from Emily and the security associates, the director nodded solemnly. Effective immediately, Greg Sullivan is relieved of managerial responsibilities pending a full ethics review. Administrative access to hotel management systems will be suspended until the investigation is complete. At nearly the same moment, Greg's electronic access badge emitted a brief tone before its indicator light changed from green to red. No dramatic announcement followed. The system simply reflected the decision that had already been made. Greg lowered the badge into his hand and stared at it silently. William then looked toward the two security associates. "You acted professionally and respectfully throughout this situation. Thank you for remaining composed." Both men nodded with visible relief. His attention shifted to Emily Carter. "You chose integrity even when it placed your own position at risk. That is exactly the standard this company exists to protect." Emily felt her eyes fill with emotion but maintained her composure. "I only believed we should verify the facts before judging someone." Ethan smiled warmly. That simple decision protected more than one guest today. It protected the character of everyone willing to listen. The elderly woman who had spoken earlier stepped forward with a gentle smile. "Young man," she said to Ethan, "I am glad you stayed." Ethan inclined his head respectfully. "So am I." Around the lobby, several guests who had quietly watched the confrontation began offering small gestures of support. One businessman apologized for assuming the worst. A family thanked Emily for speaking up. Even the couple who had whispered dismissively earlier looked genuinely uncomfortable as they reflected on how quickly appearances had shaped their own opinions. The atmosphere inside the hotel transformed without anyone raising a voice. Tension gave way to reflection. Judgment gave way to humility. William turned once more toward Ethan. "Your suite has been prepared since this morning." Ethan glanced around the lobby one final time before picking up his duffel bag. "I appreciate that," he replied. "But I appreciate something else even more." William raised an eyebrow slightly. Ethan looked toward Emily and then toward the guests still gathered nearby. Today proved that policies matter, but people matter first. Buildings become luxurious because of the values practiced inside them, not because of the stone used to build them. No one applauded immediately. The silence itself carried more respect than applause ever could, and every person standing in that magnificent lobby understood they had witnessed something far more valuable than the arrival of an important executive. They had witnessed character reveal itself when status remained hidden. Later that evening, the lobby looked exactly the way it had looked when Ethan Brooks first walked through its doors. The crystal chandeliers still reflected warm light across the marble floor. The fountain still filled the room with its quiet rhythm. Guests continued arriving with rolling suitcases and travel plans, unaware that only hours earlier the same space had become an unexpected lesson in dignity. Yet something invisible had changed. Employees greeted every guest with greater attention. Conversations carried more kindness than routine. Smiles no longer seemed reserved for people wearing expensive watches or designer clothing. Before retiring to his suite, Ethan accepted William Harrison's invitation to address the hotel leadership team for a few minutes. Managers, supervisors, front desk associates, concierge staff, housekeeping leaders, and security personnel gathered quietly in the executive meeting room overlooking the city skyline. Ethan stood at the front without a podium, without prepared notes, and without mentioning his title. He looked around the room before speaking. Today was never about proving who I was. My identity was already secure before I walked through those doors. The room remained completely silent. The real question was much simpler. How do we treat people when we believe they have nothing to offer us? Several employees lowered their eyes as they reflected on the afternoon. Ethan continued with the same calm voice that had carried him through every difficult moment. Luxury is not measured by polished stone, crystal lighting, or 5-star ratings. Luxury begins with making every guest feel respected before they ever show a reservation, a business card, or a job title. The easiest person to underestimate is often the one who teaches us our greatest lesson. William listened quietly from the back of the room with unmistakable pride. Emily Carter sat among her colleagues, realizing that one decision to speak honestly had changed not only her own future, but the direction of an entire hotel. Ethan smiled gently before concluding. Never confuse silence with weakness. Sometimes the strongest person in the room is simply the one who does not need to prove anything. No one applauded immediately. The words deserved reflection before celebration. The following morning, revised hospitality training was scheduled across every Harrison Grand property, built around one principle that appeared at the top of every page. Respect comes before recognition. Weeks later, guests noticed subtle differences throughout the company. Service became warmer. Complaints involving assumptions or profiling declined. Employees spoke proudly about a renewed culture that valued character over appearances. Emily accepted a promotion into guest experience leadership, where she helped train new associates to verify facts before forming conclusions. William and Ethan finalized their partnership exactly as planned, united by a shared belief that successful businesses are built not only through investments but through values practiced every single day. As for Greg Sullivan, the ethics review became an opportunity for personal reflection rather than public humiliation. Whether he eventually returned to hospitality would depend not on his resume, but on what he learned from the choices he had made that afternoon. Ethan never spoke publicly about the incident. He believed the lesson mattered far more than the headlines. Long after the lobby returned to its ordinary rhythm, many who had witnessed those events remembered one image above all others. It was not the gold master key. It was not the announcement of a powerful partnership. It was a quiet man standing patiently in the middle of a beautiful hotel, refusing to let someone else's assumptions determine his own dignity. Because true leadership does not begin when the world recognizes your value. It begins when you continue treating others with respect, even after they fail to recognize yours.